Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes with this government, though, we don't know whether to laugh or cry. When it comes to the way they spend money, this minister said in her fall update that the budget would be balanced in 2028. In her budget, she said it would be balanced never. Weeks before that budget, she said that deficit spending fuels inflation and interest rate hikes. Then she added $60 billion of that fuel to the inflationary fire at a cost to $4,200 per family. Why won't the minister get off the backs of the hardworking Canadians and get rid of the inflationary taxes and deficits that they have to pay?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, these Conservatives continue to relentlessly talk down Canada and the Canadian economy. But on this side of the House, we believe in Canada, and we know that Canada has the best economic performance of any country in the G7. And, Mr. Speaker, let me give you some facts to back that up. After we tabled the budget, S&P reiterated our AAA credit rating. That makes Canada one of only 3 countries in the G7 with a AAA credit rating, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2.5.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The minister herself said that in fall, that the budget would be balanced in 2028. In this budget, she stated the budget would never be balanced. And before the budget, she said that deficits put oil on the inflationary fire and added $60 billion worth of that oil. That means over $4,000 of debt for every Canadian. Why do Canadians have to pay for the incompetence and change of mind of this government? The Honourable Deputy Minister.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, it's important to understand the data and to understand that Canada is a G7 country that has the strongest economy. I will give you some facts to support that. For example, our country's economic growth in the first quarter was 2.4%. Mr. Speaker, Canada has recovered 129% of jobs lost during the pandemic and 115% in the United States. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. We see that she and the Prime Minister are completely disconnected from the daily reality of everyday Canadians, and we see why. He left the country, has been avoiding questions about the unpopular budget. In American universities, has gone to American universities instead of talking to people here. She's the one who admitted that deficits feed inflation and that she was going to find $1 of savings for every $1 of spending. Where's that promise in the budget implementation? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, last week, I was very proud to be in Japan at the meeting of G7 finance ministers. It's important for Canadians to understand that the Conservatives may think that Canada's finance minister shouldn't go to international meetings. If that's what the Conservatives think, they have to tell the truth to Canadians. About the Canadian economy, we have the strongest G7 economy, thanks to Canadians' work in our government. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Impressive that the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister are attending really important meetings in Japan and the United States with really important people around the world. We're talking to the common people right here in Canada who can't pay their bills, Mr. Speaker. 1 in 5 skipping meals because they can't afford the inflationary carbon tax on food. 1.5 million eating at food banks, some asking for help with medical assistance and dying because they can't afford to eat, heat, or house themselves. The minister admits deficits cause this inflation, yet she added $60 billion more of them. Why does she keep boosting prices while she travels abroad?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's be really clear on what the Conservatives are insinuating. The Conservatives are trying to insinuate today that there is something elitist, that there is something that goes against the interests of regular Canadians when Canadian leaders attend G7 meetings. And I want to ask Canadians, do they think it is wrong for the Prime Minister to go to a meeting with the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of the UK, the Prime Minister of Japan?
Leader of the Opposition.
No, we just wish he'd remember that the real people who pay the bills actually live right here in Canada. These are the people that Liberals forget about when they're jet-setting around the world, when this deputy minister is over in the States giving speeches at fancy American universities. She's forgetting about the people who are paying 12% more for food because of her carbon tax, forgetting 9 in 10 young people can't afford a home because she's driven up interest rates so much with her deficits, and forgetting the seniors that can't fill their fridges because food has become too expensive. Why won't she and her Prime Minister get back on the ground in Canada and stand up for the people who do the work here?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, someone who lives in government-provided accommodation in a multi-room residence with a chef and a chauffeur, and someone who has been on the public payroll his entire professional life should not suggest that our government is acting against the interests of Canadians when we attend meetings of the G7. We are proud to represent Canada at the top table in the world, and we're going to continue to do that.
L'honorable député de la Prairie.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister continues to sink in the quicksand of Chinese interference. What real action did he decide to take? Did he launch a public and independent commission of inquiry, as everyone asked? No. Did he take up the Bloc's proposal, such as a permanent office of inquiry? Nope. What did he do? He called by-elections. Every day for months, we've been talking about China interfering in our elections. And before doing a single thing about interference, he calls for elections. Is this a bad joke?
L'Honorable Ministre de la Sécurité publique.
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, we take the issue of foreign interference very seriously. To protect our institutions, we created an independent panel that's working well. We're looking forward to receiving Mr. Johnston's recommendations, a former Governor General who was appointed by a Conservative Prime Minister. With all the initiatives we've already implemented and those recommendations, we continue to protect all of our democratic institutions. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, calling for by-elections now, which could have easily been held in the fall, shows that the Prime Minister doesn't think that election interference by the Chinese isn't urgent. Neither is investigating recent elections or protecting the next ones or reestablishing the public's trust in our democracy. What's urgent for him is to measure the political price to be paid to voters for his high-profile inaction on the issue of Chinese interference. Why, once again, is the Prime Minister unable to put democracy's interests first, ahead of those of the Liberal Party?
L'Honorable Ministre.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what our government's going to do. We're going to make sure that public interests are always protected. Our government has taken real action to counter foreign interference in our institutions. I share my honourable colleagues' concerns when it comes to the need to ensure that by-elections, just like the 2019 and 2021 elections, are protected from foreign interference. We've implemented measures, and we will continue to apply them vigorously. The honourable member for Burnaby South.
There are 2,500 jobs at stake in the Windsor region because this Liberal government has not followed through on commitments they made to ensure that the plant being built by Stellantis for the Nexstar batteries goes to completion. We have already heard from the mayor of Windsor, who's raised alarm bells and written directly to the government. The unions are deeply concerned. All other levels of government have done their part. So when will this Liberal government follow through on commitments and get this plant built and ensure those jobs are protected?
Yeah. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government believes in good-paying jobs in the auto sector, and we have showed that time and again. We showed that when we fought for and secured a NAFTA deal that protected our auto sector. We showed that when we fought for and secured Canada being carved in to the U.S. EV incentives, which protected our auto sector. We showed that with the historic VW investment, which creates an auto sector for the future. And we are showing that in Windsor. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? We're going to fight for the best deal for Canada, and we're proud of that, too.
Honourable member for Burnaby South.
That answer was little comfort to the workers in Windsor. We need a deal that actually goes through and builds that plant. Le prix des loyers à travers le...
The cost of rents in Canada have skyrocketed. A two-bedroom apartment in Laval now costs an average of $2,000. That's an increase of 26% in a year. That's enormous. It's clear that this government isn't recognizing the impact of this crisis in the lives of everyday Canadians. Are they finally going to act to resolve it and help people with their rent?
L'Honorable, the Honourable.
President, we understand the importance of being there for vulnerable renters. That is why this government introduced the Canada Housing Benefit, a revolutionary measure that puts money directly in the pockets of renters and moves with them when they move from one unit to another. And we topped up that Canada Housing Benefit with the top-up to the Canada Housing Benefit. And we will be there for renters. We will keep building more affordable rental units across the country, and we'll be there for vulnerable renters all the way.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, the Prime Minister was up huffing and puffing last week, less than a week ago, about the Stellantis project, and now we find 6 days later that construction on the $5 billion facility has halted because of his incompetence. We see the same thing with the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is now 300% over budget, many years past due, and still not complete. All this Prime Minister does is wrap our industry in red tape, weigh them down in taxes, and engage in total incompetence. Why is it that he can never bring it home when it comes to jobs, paychecks, and industry for our country?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, coming from a leader and a party that is on record opposing the historic transformational VW investment made by our government, that question is frankly ridiculous. And I'll tell you what, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you who couldn't get TMX built. It is the members opposite. And I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, which government is going to get that pipeline built. Our government is going to get the job done, like we did on NAFTA, like we did with VW, like we'll do with...
The Honourable Member for Calgary, the Calgary Forest Lawn.
The most historic transformation is going to be when the Conservatives replace this incompetent government. And my question is for the Finance Minister, who refuses to show up to the Finance Committee for 2 hours to answer basic questions about her failed budget. She misled Canadians, blowing through all fiscal restraint that she promised by driving struggling households $4,200 further into debt because she threw $60 billion of inflationary fuel on the fire that she started. She spent more airtime bragging about her budget at Fenway Park than she has at the Finance Committee. Will she end her inflationary spending, show up to work, or does she think that budgets balance themselves?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am really looking forward to appearing before the Finance Committee as scheduled tomorrow. Of course, it will require the Conservatives to end their frankly childish temper tantrum, to give me the chance to appear. But I do really look forward to it, Mr. Speaker. And the reason I look...
Going to wait for silence on all sides. And while someone's answering, I would ask everyone not to shout them down. That's almost like bullying in a schoolyard. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister has 10 seconds left.
You might say, Mr. Speaker, you might even say that shouting down a woman speaking in the House is a childish temper tantrum. You might say that, but I do look forward to appearing before the committee tomorrow, as I've always been scheduled to do.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Canadians are grateful that the Finance Minister has finally returned to Canada. Inflation and higher interest rates are really challenging for a lot of people. That means one of my principal responsibility is not to pour fuel on the flames of inflation, so fiscal responsibility is really important. Mr. Speaker, those are the words of the Finance Minister just 9 weeks ago, who can't bring herself to answer basic questions about why her budget is the exact opposite. She's gone into hiding, trying to distance herself from her own government. Canadians want to know if she's going to answer the question, and if not, will she get out of the way so Conservatives can just take over?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am not, our government is not going to let Conservatives get away with ridiculous and transparent efforts to mislead Canadians.
She's right here.
The fact is that the presence of Canadian ministers, and this week the presence of our Prime Minister at a G7 meeting, is doing our job for Canadians, and Canadians know it. Now, when it comes to our budget, Mr. Speaker, you know who I trust to rate our fiscal responsibility? The ratings agencies. And S&P reaffirmed our AAA rating.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
I'll welcome her back to Canada again. But here are the actual facts. Every Canadian family will now pay $4,200 more per household for her spending spree. Housing prices have doubled. Food bank use is at record highs. Canada accumulated debt faster than almost every other advanced country, but our economy underperformed nearly all of its counterparts, and we have the lowest projected GDP growth of any, GDP per capita growth of any advanced economy for the next 30 years. Why does she continue to spread this falsehood? We can't spend our way to prosperity, so will she keep running away from questions, or will she just get up?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
You can tell when the personal attacks are increasing that it's proportional to the lack of ideas that actually help Canadians. When you look at housing supply, we're the party that has enabled more Canadians to access affordable housing, as well as more access to the dream of Canadian home ownership through the first-time home buyer tax-free savings account, a 1% tax on vacant, non-Canadian, non-residential real estate, as well as building more housing supply through the Housing Accelerator Fund. Throughout all, then come here and pretend that they care.
L'honorable député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
Monsieur le Président, les Canadiens...
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are wondering one thing. When will the government really connect with the problems that affect them directly every day? When they were in Japan or Washington or globetrotting elsewhere, the Minister of Finance has spent over... Does the Finance Minister know that 1.5 million Canadians are going to food banks? We're talking about essentials. Did she think of citizens that for 8 years now have had to pay twice as much for rents and mortgages? That's the daily reality of Canadians. When are they going to connect with that? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Encore une fois, Monsieur le Président,
Once again, Mr. Speaker, I have a question for the Conservatives. Do they think? Are they proposing an isolationist policy for Canada? Are they proposing that Canada shouldn't go to G7 meetings like the one in Washington? Are the Conservatives proposing that we don't go to meetings at the White House? Is that the Conservatives' policy? On this side of the House, We understand that Canada exists in an interconnected worldwide economy. The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, maybe the finance minister has a short memory because in November, she was proud of tabling the fall economic update and saying, that's it, we see the light at the end of the tunnel. We have a target for returning to balanced budgets. That was in November. Because a month ago, when the budget was tabled, it was zero. No return to balanced books. And worse than that, 2 weeks ago, bang, her party slapped us all in the face. Her party wants nothing to do with balanced books. The Minister of Finance, who was so proud in November to say that we're going to come back to balance, inaudible. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, there's a big difference between our government and the Conservatives. The difference is that we are proud of Canada. We're proud of the Canadian economy. When it comes to budgetary policy, the S&P agency has supported our AAA credit rating after our budget was tabled. And I think that Canadians are smart enough to believe S&P and not anti-Canadian rhetoric coming from the Conservatives. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Foreign Affairs said that the Bloc is being alarmist when it comes to the Century Initiative. But the Bloc is not the one that's scaring the world. It's the government. A government has to calculate immigration thresholds by taking into account capacity for housing and healthcare and childcare and so on. A unilateral increase in immigration thresholds puts too much pressure on those areas. Will the government acknowledge that a target of 500,000 newcomers per year is too much? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Immigration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Bloc Québécois wants to see how to protect Quebec's demographic weight, they should read the Canada-Quebec Agreement, which has been working for 3 decades. If they want to know our plan to reverse the decline of French, I invite them to read the new action plan on official languages. If they want to know our plan for supporting Francophone communities throughout all of Canada, they have to read the press release on the way we reached the 4.4% target of Francophone immigration. All they have to do is Google it.
Député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Immigration is a source of wealth in human wealth. It helps us to redefine the way that we live together, gives us new ideas and perspectives. But for that to succeed, integration has to happen. 500,000 people as a target for 2025 means that the federal government is ahead of the Century Initiative. It's impossible for Quebec to maintain its political weight or to integrate all of these newcomers. Will the minister lower the immigration thresholds? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, listen, I think the Bloc Québécois believes that the government has a crystal ball when it comes to our new immigration thresholds this is for the next 3 years and not for the next 75 years. The Minister of Immigration was clear. This decision's being made based on what seems to be the best immigration policy for Canada, based on the needs and capacity for Quebec and Canada. We will always be there to welcome immigrants. Thank you.
Honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Faut bien les accueillir. En immigration, les libéraux se drapent dans la
In immigration, Liberals wrap themselves in virtue and good feelings. They talk about a welcoming society and about receiving millions of newcomers, but they are often forgotten and suffer inhuman delays. La Presse tells us that an access to document request that should take 20 days takes a year. La Presse also informs us that a father can't go to his 6 sons' bedside because he doesn't have a refugee travel document. It's tragic. Instead of dramatically increasing thresholds, what's the minister going to do to shorten these inhumane processing times within his own department? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. I'm proud of the question because we're going to be very clear. We've made significant progress in reducing backlogs and improving services to our clients. Looking at the numbers, we've reduced more than requests by 500,000. We've processed 5.2 million requests last year, or applications last year. We are providing quality services to Canada.
For Simcoe North.
A year ago, the finance minister said she had a red line. Our debt to GDP ratio must continue to decline, the finance minister said. Pandemic debt must be paid down. This is a line we will not cross. So much for that red line. The government has increased the debt by $4,200 for each Canadian family. Our debt to GDP ratio will increase this year, and deficits now extend as far out as the eye can see. Does the finance minister regret making this cast-in-stone, stone-cold promise to Canadians?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Canada's debt and debt to GDP ratio, let me quote someone that all members of this House should trust, and that is the Parliamentary Budget Officer. At the Finance Committee a few weeks ago, he said, when looking at G7 countries, Canada compares very favorably on net debt to GDP. Further in his testimony, he described a conversation he had with Moody's, who said that Canada's deficit should make us, quote, quite happy because by European standards, that's very low. That's not me talking, Mr. Speaker. That's the Parliamentary Budget Officer.
The Honourable Member for Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, this finance minister and government have quite a bad track record of making predictions. They told us interest rates would remain low, so we must spend. They told us that deflation was more likely than inflation. And when inflation came, they said it would just be here for a little while. The minister assured us the economy would continue to grow, and now it's slowed to a halt. They're always playing catch-up, and Canadians are paying the price. We are now spending as much on interest on the debt as we are sending to provinces for health care. Right. How can Canadians afford any more of this government?
Good job, the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, let me tell you who pays the price for conservative economic policies. The people who pay the price for conservative so-called economics are the most vulnerable among us. Since we formed government, Mr. Speaker, 2.7 million Canadians have been lifted out of poverty. Our government introduced the CCB, which has lifted more than 400,000 children out of poverty, and the GIS, which has helped over 900,000 seniors. We believe in a balance between compassion and fiscal responsibility, and that's what...
If I could just ask the front benches to maybe lead the example for the rear benches, I think that would probably help things quite a bit. The Honourable Member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
The finance minister's inflationary budget is costing each Canadian family $4,200. Yet she said, and I quote, "We are absolutely determined that our debt to GDP ratio must continue to decline. Our deficits must continue to be reduced. This is a line we shall not cross." So she clearly understands her government deficits are driving up inflation, interest rates, and affordability, yet she doubles down on them. So I'll give her a chance one more time today. Will she finally listen to her own advice and cut this inflationary spending?
Yeah. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, here's the question the Conservatives have to answer. They have to tell Canadians what they would cut.
That's right.
Would they cut the $200 billion that we have invested in the healthcare system? I sure hope not, because Canadians rely on our healthcare system, and they are proud of the federal government that is supporting it. I want to ask, would they cut the $300 billion we've invested in early learning and childcare? Again, I think they kind of want to cut that. I sure hope they never form government. This party doesn't, because you know what? Canadian families need that support that we are providing.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
A recent report has now found that Halifax has become the third most expensive city in the country when it comes to rentals. They experienced an increase in rental prices of 25% in 1 year. 25%, that's a massive increase in rent. It's clear that this Liberal government has failed renters. So what are they going to do to bring down the cost of rent in our country?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
We understand that more and more Canadians are facing challenges with respect to rental payments. Although the regulation and rent control issues are under provincial jurisdiction, we on this side of the House believe that we should do everything that we can to have the backs of renters. That means building more affordable rental supply over the life of the National Housing Strategy, putting money in the pockets of vulnerable renters through the Canada Housing Benefit, and making sure that we are always fighting hard for more supply and particularly more affordable rental supply across the country in all communities from coast to coast to coast.
Member for North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, women veterans feel invisible. This government doesn't hear their experiences, stories, or pain. Virtually no research is being funded about military women's health issues, including mental health. While New Democrats welcome the recently announced mood and anxiety treatment guidelines, the unique challenges of female veterans must be considered. Will the minister commit today to including women veterans and creating these guidelines so that women who bravely served our country can finally be seen?
The Honourable Minister for Veterans Affairs.
I appreciate my honourable colleague's question. Our priority is to make sure our veterans have the support they need, and we're committed to gender-based analysis in designing our policy. We take this very seriously, and that's why we created the Office of Women and LGBTQ Veterans. That's also why we hosted the first ever Women's Veterans Forum in 2019, and we continue it on an annual basis, and we'll continue to make sure women veterans are treated properly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Mississauga Malton.
Speaker, I'd like to highlight the great news we received last week that Bill C-46 received royal assent here in the House and a quick but thorough study in the Senate. Can the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance highlight how this bill will help Canadians in my riding of Mississauga Malton?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Mississauga Malton for his question and for his hard work for his constituents and for all Canadians. He's right. Last week, Bill C-46 received royal assent. And this is good news for his constituents and for the constituents of every single member of this House, because it is going to deliver the new grocery rebate to the most vulnerable Canadians who need that support the most, and it's going to deliver a $2 billion top-up to support our healthcare system. That is Liberal government in action, Mr. Speaker.
Lake Country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Finance Minister is not answering questions, and it is on her watch that the OECD calculates Canada will be the worst performing advanced economy over 2020 to 2030 and is on this path until 2060. This means Canadian living standards and our quality of life relative to other countries have declined and will continue to. This is due to the Finance Minister's high tax, high debt, high spend budgets, and this Liberal budget right now will add $4,200 to every Canadian family. So when will the Finance Minister reverse course on her Made in Canada path to decline for Canadian families?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am not a virtual reality creation here. I am standing up in this House and very glad to answer questions about the economic policy which is delivering results for Canadians and which has Canada as the strongest economy in the G7. So let me share some facts rather than overheated, torqued conservative rhetoric. Canada has a AAA credit rating reaffirmed by S&P after we tabled our budget. Canada has the strongest economic growth and the lowest debt to GDP.
For Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia Headingley.
The Finance Minister plans to spend $490 billion in this budget, but is refusing to show up at the Finance Committee for just 2 hours to answer questions. It's a budget that will drive every Canadian family another $4,200 into debt. Canada has the 5th highest increase in government spending, the 3rd largest increase in our debt to GDP. Our debt has increased faster than almost every other advanced country. Just last November, she promised to balance the budget by 2028. This budget, her deficits go on forever and ever. Why is she breaking that promise?
Yeah. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Get up and say it because it makes no sense. The finance minister has said she's there tomorrow. So I don't know why they haven't revised their questions, but I will ask Mr. Speaker, if they give me the chance.
I'm going to ask the Honourable Government House Leader to wait a second until everything calms down so that we can hear his answer. Okay. The Honourable Member for Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia Headingley, wants to hear the answer. Please start from the top, please.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, the finance minister is appearing tomorrow, so it does seem ridiculous for the finance minister to keep standing and saying she's going to be there tomorrow. But I do want to come back to them questioning why the finance minister of a G7 country would participate in G7 meetings. Well, Mr. Speaker, it may be because we live in an interconnected economy. You know, when the Conservatives were dealing with issues like climate change, they went to world forums to attack action on climate change and to drag other countries out of doing the essential work of protecting our planet. We talk to other countries because we understand we live in an interconnected world, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you. We do welcome the finance minister back to the House here. But what we're asking for, let's be clear, is for 2 hours of her time. That's $1 billion a minute. You know what? We have real problems. According to a university report, we have the third largest increase in its total debt to GDP ratio, which has resulted in one of the lowest GDP growth ratios. In fact, we're to be at the bottom of the OECD going forward. Will the minister finally come to Finance Committee for 2 hours to explain why she's broken all of her promises?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
It's typical of the Conservatives that they won't take yes for an answer. The finance minister is going to committee tomorrow, so long as they don't filibuster it. But let's talk about our economic record, Mr. Speaker. They were talking about the OECD.
Interrupt again. It's starting to get a little noisy. I'm having a hard time hearing the answer, and I'm sure the Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South, is having a hard time hearing a response to his question. So I'm going to ask the Honourable Minister for Families to start from the top, please.
Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, it's typical of the Conservatives to take yes for an answer as the Minister of Finance is scheduled to go tomorrow. But of course, that will depend on the Conservatives to stop their filibuster. But let's talk about our economic record, Mr. Speaker. My honourable colleague was talking about the OECD. Well, when the Conservatives came into office back in 2006, they ranked 17th when it came to child poverty. By the time they left in 2015, Canada ranked 24th, Mr. Speaker. They fell. So I'm not going to take any lessons from the Conservatives, but currently Canada ranks second in OECD when it comes to reducing child poverty. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Well, that's great news, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to having the finance minister for 2 hours, as you just said. That's terrific. What we don't look forward to is this Liberal budget bonanza that's going to drive Canadians deeper into debt. Per family, $4,200 deeper into debt. And what will they get for that $4,200? Higher energy costs, higher food costs, and a lower standard of living. Will this finance minister finally come to Finance Committee for 2 hours to explain why Canada's economic growth is predicted to be lower than Latvia, Chile?
I'm going to interrupt. Now I'm having a hard time hearing the question. So I just... Order. 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 When I try to calm things down, it doesn't mean you get to throw rocks just because you think you don't live in glass houses anymore. Please, everybody, calm down. The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South, from the top, please, and we'll hear the full question. Well, we want to hear the full question. Let's see if we can get through that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for quieting that childish temper tantrum. This Liberal budget bonanza is driving Canadians further and further into debt. Each Canadian family is being driven down to the cost of $4,200 a month. And what are Canadians getting for it? Higher energy costs, higher food costs. I'm going to repeat this question one more time. Will the minister appear for 2 hours to explain her failed economic record?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you shouldn't be only too troubled by not hearing the question from the Conservatives, because it is the same nonsensical question we have heard repeatedly and which we have answered repeatedly. So let me assure everyone that I am looking forward to appearing before the Finance Committee tomorrow, as I have enjoyed questions today. And as to what Liberal economic policy is delivering for Canadians, let me say this. Jobs, jobs, jobs. The strongest job market in Canadian history, and that's what matters to hard-working Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. The Trans Mountain Pipeline project continues to be a major drain on the public purse. It's engulfing money at a frightening rate. When the government bought the pipeline from Kinder Morgan, they estimated the cost of the expansion at $7.4 billion. By 2020, it was $12.6, and by 2022, it was $21.4. Today, it's $30.9 billion and counting. What's the limit, Mr. Speaker? How far is the federal government going to indebt Canadians for the sole purpose of selling dirty oil? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we know how important it is to get a fair price for our resources on international markets. The government does not intend to be the long-term owner of this pipeline, and the divestment process will be launched once the project is further ahead. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Trans Mountain's expansion at our expense is not just an economic failure, it's an environmental disaster, because after spending so much money on this project, this Crown Corporation will need to run the tap for a long time. Trans Mountain expects to move 890,000 barrels of oil every day after the expansion, and it's going to take a lot of flow to pay off a $31 billion debt. But what about our environmental debt to future generations, Mr. Speaker? Who's going to take care of that? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our government is very proud of our industrial plan. It's a green plan. It's a plan that's investing $120 billion in the green transition. It's a historic step that will protect the climate globally and create good jobs for a whole generation of Canadians. We're very proud to be the government that's doing that. Brentford Brent.
Mr. Speaker, the Public Safety Minister falsely stated that all Beijing-backed police stations have been shut down. Now he confirms that new stations may still be operating on Canadian soil. Minister, words matter. This incompetent minister continues to mislead this House regarding this crucial issue. He has all the intelligence and security agencies at his disposal to get to the bottom of the issue. Simple question, Minister. Just looking for a number. How many Beijing-backed police stations are still operating in this country?
I want to remind the honourable members to place their questions through the chair and try to use as parliamentary language as possible. Don't push it to the limit. Just try to be as nice and play well together. The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, by now, I hope my Conservative colleague will have heard the answers, which have been consistent, that the RCMP took decisive and concrete action to disrupt the foreign interference activities in relationship to those so-called police stations, and of course they will continue to do the same going forward. The bigger question, Mr. Speaker, is what the Conservatives did about foreign interference when they last held the reins of government. The answer is nothing. On this side of the House, we will continue to make the investments and put the authorities in place so that we can protect our democratic institutions.
The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Public Safety admitted to CTV News that there were a number of Chinese police stations operating in Canada, even though he said the opposite at committee. The CSIS and Safeguard Defenders, a Spanish human rights organization, identified that there were Chinese police stations operating in Canada.
Now that the minister admitted what the situation is, can you tell us how many police stations, Chinese police stations, are still operating in Canada? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, you have to listen to the government answers, including at committee. I said that the RCMP took action to disrupt these so-called foreign police stations and other foreign interference. Now we need to protect our democratic institutions, and only the Conservatives have been obstructing progress on this important issue. The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, I don't think the Conservatives have been obstructive. I think we've been proactive. The minister says the RCMP has done this and that, but the answer is simple. How many Beijing-backed police stations are currently operating in Canada? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, supported by initiatives and investments by the federal government, the RCMP has remained vigilant, not just with respect to foreign interference, but with respect to all public safety issues. And only the Conservatives continue to obfuscate and obstruct the government's priorities when it comes to national security. We need to work together to protect our democratic institutions. That's the focus of our government. The Honourable Member for Pontiac. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Government of Canada and the Government of Quebec announced the largest acquisition of electric buses in North America. This project will put 1,229 new electric buses assembled at the Nova Bus plant in Saint-Eustache on Quebec roads by 2027. Can the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Infrastructure and Communities explain to the House how the government's historic investment will improve the lives of Quebecers and contribute to Canada's transition to a green economy? The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for Pontiac for her question. Canadians rely on public transit to get where they need to go. That's why the Government of Canada is investing $780 million in 1,229 new electric buses in Quebec. With this historic investment, our government, in partnership with Quebec, is working to reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, create more green jobs, good jobs in manufacturing in Quebec, and to give Quebecers a modern and reliable transportation network.
Mr. Speaker, a few weeks ago, a mother and her child were fatally stabbed in a random attack outside of an Edmonton school. The suspected killer had been released on bail 18 days prior. He had a long history of violence, Mr. Speaker, and had he not been released, this woman and her child would still be alive. And so the Edmonton Police Department and police departments across the country are demanding serious bail reform. Will this Liberal government finally listen and reverse all of their reckless catch-and-release bail policies, Mr. Speaker? Will they do that?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Our sympathies obviously go out to the family in question here. Canadians deserve to feel safe, and Mr. Speaker, we're taking measures in concert with the provinces and territories to do just that. The honourable member will notice that there is something on the order paper, and that hopefully that bail reform will be coming soon, Mr. Speaker. But we have listened, we have worked with our provinces and territories, our provincial and territorial counterparts. We've worked with police associations. We have listened to them, Mr. Speaker, and we have a plan moving forward.
Honourable Member for Kildonan and St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, the challenging thing is how can Canadians trust this Liberal minister when it's his Liberal government that created the problem?
That's right.
And it's not just us saying this. If you look at last month, the Victoria Police Department warned the public that a man charged with 10 counts of sexual assault with a weapon had been released on bail.
Wow.
And why was this vile rapist released on bail, you may ask, Mr. Speaker? Well, the Victoria Police Department pointed to Bill C-75, a Liberal bill from 2019 that reformed the bail system, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm asking if they will reverse all of their reckless and dangerous catch-and-release bail policies and keep Canadians safe once and for all, Mr. Speaker. Will they do that?
The Honourable Minister. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I obviously share the honourable member's concern. Bill C-75, Mr. Speaker, did not fundamentally change the law of bail in Canada. It codified a number of Canadian Supreme Court decisions, and in certain cases, Mr. Speaker, with respect to sexual assault, made it harder to get bail by adding another reverse onus provision in that particular bill. Mr. Speaker, we have heard the call with respect to repeat violent offenders. We've heard the call with respect to offenses with weapons. And, Mr. Speaker, we've promised to act. It's a complicated problem, but we're doing it together with the provinces and the territories.
Very good, David. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Les Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, we've been saying this for a long time. Major changes are needed to the legislation that allows dangerous criminals and even repeat offenders out on bail. The result? Criminals end up on our streets instead of behind bars. This has to change. Will the Prime Minister put an end to the revolving door system he created, make the necessary changes, keep criminals in jail, and protect our communities? The Honourable Minister of Justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians deserve to be safe and feel safe. And that's precisely what we've been doing since October. We've been working with the provinces and territories and with our justice counterparts and public safety counterparts to look at how we can improve the bail system, particularly in the case of repeat offenders and violent crimes. Mr. Speaker, that's precisely what we're doing. Thank you.
Calgary Skyview.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians across the country are watching as wildfires rage across central and northern Alberta. Frontline responders are courageously fighting the fires and evacuating communities. Tens of thousands of Albertans have been forced from their homes. Can the government update this House on what support they're offering the province in this trying time?
Good question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, l'Honourable Secrétaire. Wait a minute, we've got the Honourable Minister of Defence.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Member for his question, and our thoughts are with all Albertans during this difficult time. The Canadian Armed Forces have deployed approximately 300 members to assist with fighting fires as well as airlift and engineering supports, Mr. Speaker. We are also making sure to match Red Cross donations. The Prime Minister is in Alberta today, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to stand with Albertans during their time of need. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
After ignoring 20 non-compliance orders from the Human Rights Tribunal and spending $10 million fighting First Nation kids in court, this government has a new scheme. They're simply ignoring their obligation to pay the therapists who are providing the First Nation children's services under Jordan's principle. The minister's policies are in direct defiance of the Rights Tribunal ruling, and this is threatening to put child therapists into bankruptcy. We're talking about the most fragile children in the country. Why is this government so determined to deny First Nation children access to Jordan's principal services for which they are entitled?
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, since July 1st, 2016, the federal government has approved an estimated 2.56 million products under Jordan's principle, Mr. Speaker. That means that Indigenous children are getting the health services they need all across the country. And, Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite knows, I'm looking into this particular case. We'll ensure that providers who provide services can get paid in an acceptable time frame to continue to deliver those services.
L'Honorable Député de Richmond.
The Honourable Member for Richmond, Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, in the 2019 election, the Liberals promised to plant 2 billion trees to capture carbon. A year later, they earmarked $3.2 billion to get the job done. But according to the Commissioner of the Environment's latest report, an audit of the first 2 years of planting shows that at this rate, we won't even get to 4% of the total promised trees by the end of 2030. Mr. Speaker, cities, provinces, and the public have a right to know how this is going to be accomplished. Where's the $3.2 billion and what's the plan? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we'd like to thank the Commissioner for his report, and we take it seriously. Between the study and the release of the report, we negotiated 6 deals for the planting of 260 million trees. And in Quebec last week, the Environment Minister was there to announce that 275 million trees had been planted. We're on track, and we will get the job done. That's all the time we have for question period.
Conformément à l'ordre adopté le jour.
It being 3:15, pursuant to order made on Thursday, June 23, 2022, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion of Mr. Blanchette relating to the business of supply.
Members.